Thanks so much. That's great. Terrific. Can you hear me now on the lav mic? Great. Super. It's an honor to be here with you in Boston, or as we say back at our firm, the home of Examity, Evertrue, and AdmitHub. I'm here. It's great, so great to be here among so many friends and partners. My partner, Troy Williams, is here, the hands down the single best education investor in the market. If you're looking for capital, talk to him, not to me today. But I'm here to share with you a story of sort of what we've seen in the higher education market over the past 5 to 7 years. And really, it's a story of our journey as a firm from being focused on college to being focused on workforce. And hopefully, it will be instructive to you as well. There are many out there, including some nearby, who have predicted the demise of colleges and universities. Some, I'm not going to name names, but 10 years ago predicted that half of the colleges and the universities in the country would have closed by now. They haven't, and I'm not a sort of doomsayer in terms of saying thousands are going to close. I do think there will be significant changes. I do think what we've seen over the last decade is that we have an extremely resilient set of institutions who are figuring out a way to soldier on even in the face of enrollment declines. And we should be happy about that because there's a lot to love in college. I love college. I grew up as the son of a community college faculty member. My first job was at that community college. And the mission of equipping students with the critical thinking skills they need to be successful in any job are laudable and worth preserving and protecting. The combination of depth and breadth, I think, we don't see in other systems outside of the U.S. So there's a lot to love here. At the same time, what we've seen over the last, call it 40 years, is an increasing focus on higher education is really the sole pathway to active participation in the dynamic economy. And so the debate or discussion around college becomes a much broader debate around skills and around economic growth and economic mobility, as you'll see. I'm going to offer a number of predictions in this presentation, but recognize that some may not appreciate what my poor attempts at wit. There was one, I wrote a piece last year in Inside Higher Ed where the commentary was, what you imagine to be your jaunty style is just the snowballing record of your ignorance. And that's a phrase that my kids enjoy repeating at home a lot. So if there's something you don't agree with, you can just chalk it up to that. Okay. So I'm going to sort of race through some of the challenges. I'll call these sort of textbook challenges. You're certainly aware of them, but I'll sort of check them off and say, here's the, despite the fact that we all love college, we all graduated from college, here are the broad critiques of the system as it exists today. Number one, we're not completing enough students. Somewhere between 40 to 50% of students who enroll in a post-secondary program fail to complete that program. America has the highest rate of matriculation into its colleges and universities and the lowest rate of completion in the developed world. So that is a real problem. Some of that certainly stems from the open access from community colleges and the transfer bridge to four-year institutions. That's where millions of students get lost in that transition. But the end result is that almost half of students who enroll fail to complete their desired program. In my new book, A New You, I profile a number of dropouts, so students who entered the system with every intention of earning a traditional credential and failed to complete those programs. And some of them got lost at the point of transfer between community college and traditional four-year universities. Some just didn't see the point anymore. And for many of them, life just got in the way, as it tends to with any extended multi-year journey. So completion is complaint number one. Complaint number two, it'd be very familiar to you, affordability. Right? It is ridiculous that last year there was a Hollywood film starring Will Ferrell and Amy Poehler, the premise of which was the high cost of college. And so to keep their daughter in school, they did the obvious thing, which is to open up a casino in the mini mansion next door. It's ridiculous that last summer, the New York Times had a headline about Notre Dame. Does God want you to spend $300,000 for college? It's ridiculous that a few years back, a sophomore at Duke University attributed her participation in the adult film industry on the high cost of Duke tuition. And it's ridiculous that our president, in his first formal remarks as president on higher education, used the term crippling debt to describe the system. That was in the context of his new apprenticeship initiative. Here are some sobering numbers. You can see we now have over $1.5 trillion in student loan debt. The average graduate who takes out loans comes out with almost $40,000 in student loan debt. Only less than 60% of graduates are current on their student loans. Shockingly, between 2006 and 2011, 1/3 of borrowers have already defaulted on their student loans, those graduates who graduated in the post-recession period. Almost half of the colleges and universities in the country have a majority of graduates who are making interest-only payments on their loans, meaning they have negative amortizing loans. The loan balances are not going down, they're either staying the same or going up. And this was a recent headline in a publication, Stop Calling Millennials the Facebook generation. They're the student loan generation. This is resulting in unprecedented unhappiness on the part of alumni. Every alumni survey you see, there's unhappiness among alumni in general, and the more recent the graduate, the more unhappy the alum. 30% of young alums say they would sell an organ to get rid of their student loan debt. We've seen a complete transformation. In 2005, before the Great Recession, a majority of 20-something young adults lived outside of the home, away from their parents, independently in 35 states. Today, that's now only true in 6 states. So we have a generation that is living in the basement, and 76% of parents with adult kids living in the basement say they'd pay at least $24,000 to get them out of the basement. So, and it's also affected the debate in Washington, D.C., where the Republican Party has now adopted this basically as a party line, which is that it's crazy to think that the only pathway to a good job has to run through a college campus and a four-year degree. A lot of the unhappiness, I think, stems not just from affordability, but from the fact that millennials are performing worse on virtually every economic metric than the generations that preceded them. In terms of wealth, in terms of income, in terms of home ownership, even in terms of new business creation, at a time when it should be easier to create a new business than ever. Millennials are less entrepreneurial than prior generations. And so it's not just a function of affordability, right? If every student graduated into a $60,000 a year starting salary job, the cost of college would be fine, right? We'd be able to figure out, make those loan payments. It's the interplay between affordability and employability. So let's talk about that. So one challenge is that colleges and universities aren't great at keeping up with workforce needs, right? You know, there are success stories, to be sure, right? This was a Chronicle of Higher Education article that talked about the fact that Texas A&M University developed a new bachelor's degree program in cybersecurity, and it only took them 2 years to do that. And so they applauded it. The problem is that in that same article, lauding the accomplishment of A&M, they asked, the author asked a question, which I think represents really the mainstream thinking in higher education, but which is this just a trap? Because aren't these tools that we're teaching students going to be obsolete in 5 or 10 years? And I ask you, in what other industry would you say, let's not develop this new product because it might be obsolete in 5 or 10 years, right? You wouldn't have iPhones, you wouldn't have life-saving medical devices if that were the case. But that is the prevailing attitude in traditional higher education. Sarah Goldrick-Rab is a sort of well-followed a faculty member on academic Twitter and in response to my question about the goal of aligning curriculum with labor market needs, the response that I think this is typical is that this is not a shared goal, it's a questionable goal. If you were to take 100 faculty members assembled at random, bring them into a room and ask them, how many of you went into teaching, went into academe with the purpose of equipping students with the skills they need to obtain good first jobs? You wouldn't get very many hands, right? That's not why they do what they do. So that is a challenge. Another challenge is that the primary interface on any campus with the world of employers and employment is career services, which is one office among many, located typically on the periphery of campus, not open evenings and weekends. Only about 50% of students actually walk in, and those who do are more likely to meet someone who's worked their entire career in career services than in the industries they're trying to get connected to. So that would be great if the growth industry of the future was career services, but it's not. So we have a real problem where we have college graduates graduating into underemployment. I talk in my book about students who majored in computer science and end up waiting tables for a number of years. Why is that? We're going to talk about that in detail. I don't have in the book sort of the prototypical liberal arts graduate who then becomes a Starbucks barista. But there's lots of examples of graduates working retail, working frontline jobs that really they could have had without the degree, right? Without the 4, 5, 6 years, without the tens of thousands of dollars of student loan debt into their first job. And so what is underemployment? We're not talking unemployment, right? College graduates have a very low unemployment rate because when you graduate with student loan debt, you're going to take the first job that allows you to make your loan payments. So we're talking underemployment, meaning you could have gotten the job without the investment. The Federal Reserve Bank of New York estimates that 45% of new college grads are working in an underemployed capacity. We know that it's acute. On average, the underemployed graduate makes $10,000 less per year on average. We know that it's persistent now. So a recent, an important study from Strata and Burning Glass found that if you're underemployed in your first job after graduating, 2/3 of the time you're going to be underemployed 5 years later, and half the time you'll be underemployed 10 years later, right? Which makes sense. Careers are path dependent. Your second, your third employer is going to care a lot about what that first job was. Maybe even more about that than they did about where you went to college and what you majored in or whether you went to college. And we'll talk more about that in a bit as well. And we know that it's actually really important to get a job before you graduate as well. In another survey from Strata, if you land a job before you graduate, you're 2.5 times more likely to eventually make over $60,000 as opposed to those who didn't have a job at graduating, which speaks to the importance of career services and the failure there. So this combination of the interplay between affordability and employability leads to what we believe is the most significant change in higher education over the past, call it 20 years or so, which is 20 years ago, if you'd surveyed young people or older people, anyone who was matriculating into a college or university program, and you asked them why are you doing this? About half would give you an answer relating to job, career, or income. The other half would be, range of, I want to improve myself, I want to become a better person. Today, when you ask that question, it's not as varied. Consistently over 90% say the reason they are doing this is related to employment, career, and increasingly getting a good first job. Another reason for this employment imperative, we believe, is that young people are actually engaged in paid employment much less than they were even 10 years ago or so, certainly than when I was growing up, right? The objective today, again, with our increasing focus on college as the only pathway, is what you should be doing instead of working at Baskin-Robbins scooping ice cream, is burnishing your college application with unpaid intern experiences and volunteer experiences and travel study. Make yourself a more interesting person, and that's what we tell our kids. What they're not getting, they're not getting the soft skills that you learn in those jobs. I was actually in Boston in the fall giving a presentation much like this. And there was a woman in the audience who said, well, I don't understand because, I'm trying to hire candidates, young people for jobs, and they just simply don't have the soft skills. And I said, well, what is your business? She says, well, I run a travel study business for high school students. I said, well, look in the mirror. Because that's what they're doing. They're doing your travel study programs. They're not engaging in paid work. So in any event, the point is that the young people today are now entering, they're reaching the age of 23, 24, many of them never having had a paid work experience, believe it or not. And so they don't have a sense that they actually can support themselves. And so that just adds to this anxiety around that first job and the employment imperative. All right, now I've said a lot about how higher education is to blame for these challenges, but the reality is actually that most of it isn't higher education's fault, right? We're in the midst of a digital revolution, revolutionizing how businesses work, changing functions and processes and systems from manual to digital. And one of the systems that's been changed is hiring. Right? Today, every good job that a college graduate or a young person or an older person might want is posted online. And every online job posting generates 300, 400, 500 resumes. Right? How are businesses, how are employers responding? Well, no one is sifting through 500 resumes. What they are doing is they're using applicant tracking systems to manage them. What are these applicant tracking systems? They're keyword-based filters that sit on top of their HR systems. And they look at the keywords in the job description and see if they match the keywords that they're able to parse from the resume. And if they can't find enough keywords, you won't make it through, meaning you're actually not going to be seen by a human being at that employer. So here's an example. This was a New York Times op-ed, and this was a small PR firm that had an account director position available. They posted it online very quickly, 500 applications. Who applied? Auto collections managers, home health aides, visual merchandisers. How do you distinguish? How are you going to figure out which 20 or 10 you want to talk to? Well, you're relying on the keyword-based filter in the applicant tracking system. Now, at the same time, over the last decade, we've seen a huge shift in the skills that employers are requiring for entry-level jobs, right? And there's a good reason for that and a bad reason. The change we've seen is an increasing focus on technical or digital skills in these job descriptions. The good reason is that, as I said, the economy is digitized. So the typical entry-level job today is probably best described with entry-level job with career path and opportunity. It's probably best described as sitting in an enterprise or organization and using a SaaS platform to help manage a business function of some kind. So that's a good reason. The bad reason is that there are only so many ways to say critical thinking, problem solving, communication skills in job descriptions, but you can always add a technical or digital skill. And so faced with this deluge of 400, 500 resumes for every job description, HR managers and hiring managers have resorted to trying to tighten the net by adding skills to job descriptions. And what skills are they adding? They're not adding cognitive skills or soft skills, they're adding technical, digital skills to job descriptions. And colleges and universities just aren't keeping up. I gave a presentation a few months ago to about 200 college and university leaders, and I asked them, how many of your schools provide any training or preparation at all in Salesforce, the most commonly used SaaS platform in American business? Not one hand went up. So therein lies the problem. These technical skills, everyone talks about coding. It's not just coding. Right? There are SaaS platforms to manage business functions horizontally. Every industry has a range of insurance claims, for example. There are probably 5 major SaaS platforms that insurance companies are using for that. And those claims administrators, which a decade ago would have been a great entry-level job for college students, many of those job descriptions today will now list the software package in the job description. That's a big problem. And so I think one of the other challenges we have is that we assume that young people today are digital natives, right? They're very facile in a digital world. They know how to use Netflix. They have an iPhone. But my point here is that an iPhone and Netflix and Spotify are a world away from the very, very complex, hard to use business software packages that are trying to solve multiple problems, really trying to replicate the functions of the enterprise digitally. Medical records, electronic medical record software. The level of training required to move a hospital to an EMR system is hundreds of hours per employee. And increasingly, those employers want those candidates ready to go on day one. They don't want to invest in entry-level hiring for that. So the problem we have is this, which is if you map job descriptions for young people on this matrix where certain jobs require a good deal of education, meaning a degree, and some don't, and some require significant some experience and some require none, we've seen an emptying out of that sort of entry-level job for college graduates, jobs that require a degree but no experience. The reactions here from the sort of in the higher ed world are several. The first, not surprisingly, is the push for free college. Something in this equation is not working, so let's make college free. There are a couple of problems with that. One is that even free tuition doesn't mean free college, right? You still have to support yourself. Even if we were to figure out how to pay for 4-year free college, you'd have millions of young people going through, still taking on debt to pay for room and board and living expenses and books and so forth. So challenges there, even if we could figure out how to pay for it. The second is that we've seen the rise of what we call the anti-credential, meaning that there are thousands of young people walking around where their credential is the fact that they dropped out, and they're proud of that. They're advertising that, and they're in Silicon Valley, people with dropout on their backpacks and T-shirts. The third and most important is our enrollment declines. So we are seeing over half of colleges and universities failing to meet budget or target enrollment goals with a large focus at small and middle-sized schools outside of the most dynamic urban areas. So if you're at private schools, for sure, and you've heard in the last month, I think, 3 have announced they're closing. So those are the schools that are most at risk. But even mid-sized and small public universities that are outside of the big cities are at risk and are seeing enrollment declines of 5 to 10% on an annual basis. Here's an example of how not to react to this. If you're a college or university, Kathy Davidson from CUNY, she wrote recently in the Washington Post that this is not our problem. That even if we were to create the most relevant education in the world, it cannot change a labor market that's rigged against the middle class. It's a social problem, not a higher education problem. And I reject that. I paraphrase Donald Rumsfeld here and say, look, this is the labor market we have, not the labor market you might want or wish to have at a future time. This is the labor market we're sending our students into. We cannot abandon them at all, which leads to the broader context of the skills gap, making sure that we're equipping young people for the jobs that are out there today and the jobs of the future. So we have a full employment economy effectively, but there are a number of signs that all's not well in the labor market. Since the Great Recession, we've seen a decline in labor market participation. So this is what's driving, in part, the low unemployment rate, is 10 million workers have sort of fallen out of the workforce and aren't actively looking for work, so aren't counted as unemployed. The single biggest issue we face today as a society is increasing inequality, and the fact that the wage and income gains over the last 30, 40 years are entirely at the top of the spectrum, and everyone else has been flat or so. We have now 6.9, it was last month, 6.9 million unfilled jobs in the country, and by our estimate, the majority of those jobs are not low-skilled jobs, right? They're not sort of frontline retail jobs or custodial jobs. These are middle and high-skill jobs that require skills and training, and employers are unable to find candidates to fill these jobs. And then crucially, diversity. We see real diversity problems in the big industries of the future as well. So here are and that's in addition to the underemployment of young people and the challenges that millennials are facing. We view the skills gap as the source of most of our related to the challenge, most of the major domestic challenges we face as a country. The fact that we have millions of workers who are out of place relative to the industries of today and the future. And we see that as reflected in the sense that the American dream has collapsed or is collapsing, the sense that good jobs are out of reach, and particularly the sense that good jobs really are only reached through a 4 to 6 year journey through a college classroom that requires taking on debt. Life cannot get in the way in the interim. So that's too hard for too many of our young people and older workers who require upskilling and retraining. And guess what? It's not going to get better. Right? You've all heard about future of work initiatives. The technology, AI, RPA is going to make this much worse in 5 years and 10 years. So we need to get on top of it now. Plus the fact that the safety valve that many of employers have been using over the last 10, 20 years of bringing talent in on H-1B visas, that window is narrowing. This administration has made it clear that they're going to crack down on employers who are abusing H-1Bs. And there's a real need to make sure that we are sourcing talent correctly in this market. So why do we have the skills gap? Well, we've boiled it down to sort of two frictions that contribute to it. On the individual side, why does everyone not just go out and get upskilled in the digital skills of the future that everyone needs? Well, there's the time to upskill, the cost of upskilling, and most importantly, the uncertainty of a positive employment outcome if you do so. Right? If we could eliminate all of those, millions of people would go out and immediately get upskilled in at least what they thought were the skills of the jobs of the future. So that's education friction on the individual side. But that's not the only friction. Employers also have this hiring friction, meaning employers today are less likely than ever to hire someone for a job where the candidate literally hasn't demonstrated that they've done that job before. So that's relating to what I was saying before about entry-level jobs and putting software and technical skills and for entry-level sales jobs that a decade ago were a great starting off point for a new college graduate. Today they'll say we want 2 years of Salesforce experience. Well, how do you get 2 years of Salesforce experience unless you've already worked as a salesperson for 2 years? So you go round and round in a circle. So there's this hiring friction where employers really don't want to take a risk. And look, I get it. I'm an employer. Right? The cost of a bad hire is anywhere between 6 to 9 months of that person's salary. It's expensive. New college graduates churn out of their first job. Half of them churn within 2 years of their first job. So, why make that investment? Why do that? And so American employers have largely disinvested in early career or entry-level hiring. So all this has led us to we came up with this concept of last-mile training. And last-mile training represents how to best fill the gap between what our current post-secondary institutions provide and what employers are looking for, with a focus on digital skills, digital training. So at a minimum, making sure that candidates aren't screened out by the ATS, they at least have those keywords, and hopefully providing exactly the training and experience that employers are looking for to make these candidates productive from day one. There's also a soft skills component to it as well. You need to make sure you get through the interview. Otherwise, you're not going to get hired. But most importantly, the structure needs to be, let's figure out how to absorb these frictions. Let's absorb the education friction. Let's absorb the hiring friction away from the employer. Try to create a frictionless pathway. And I'll give you some examples of how you do that. Effectively, what we're suggesting is this is a design thinking approach to this education to employment challenge. Everything we've done in education up until recently has been, if you will, left to right. Right? Middle school builds on elementary school, secondary school builds on middle school, and post-secondary education builds on what students have learned in high school, without regard to the outcome. And what we're suggesting is, as in design thinking, build backwards. Build backwards from the first job and what's required. They're particularly important in an era where the motivating force is the employment imperative. Because students today no longer buy that line that college prepares you for your fifth job. They know that if you don't get a good first job, you're probably not going to get a good fifth job, and the data supports that. So that's what we're talking about here. Last mile training programs, they're everywhere today. The boot camps, and they combine these elements. I won't go into them. You're familiar with them. But I want to sort of move from the boot camp model, which is an improvement on traditional post-secondary education, which if you map it on this matrix, traditional college is in that bottom quadrant, right, where you're being asked to take a financial risk as a student with no guaranteed employment outcome. What we are seeing and we're focused on are models that move to the top right quadrant immediately, where there's no financial risk to the student, and where you're guaranteed an employment outcome. You might say, well, what's that? How does that work? Well, I'll tell you. We've seen, even in the tuition bootcamp space, a shift away from tuition pay to income share, which along my sort of framework of education friction and hiring friction, you'd say, well, what income share is doing is it's reducing the education friction for young people. You're reducing that financial risk. Now, you're not guaranteeing a job, so it's not eliminating the education friction, but it's reducing it. So we are big fans of income share agreements. We think that's a very, very helpful development. It aligns the institution, the provider's interest very strongly with the candidate's interest in getting to that good first job. So that's productive. But we're most focused on models that eliminate both frictions. So how do you do that? So this is Reviture. And what Reviture is a IT staffing company that we've repurposed into a frictionless pathway to employment. They partner with colleges and universities. They offer free boot camps on campus and advanced technologies that employers are seeking. And they're custom training candidates on exactly what employers are looking for. But the best part is that there's no cost to this student. In fact, students are hired as employees from day one of the program, so they're being paid. So no cost, guaranteed job, no education friction. And on the employer side, no hiring friction, because Reviture hires the candidate and staffs them out to the employer for up to 2 years on a try before you buy basis. So employers don't need to make a hiring decision until the talent is proven. So it's the intermediary here absorbing the education friction and the hiring friction into itself, taking on the risk and reaping the reward on the back end. And its revenue model is the spread between what they're billing the talent out at and what they're paying the talent for that two-year period. Great outcomes here. We see great diversity as well in the population that we're able to train. We think skills are more broadly distributed and competencies much more broadly distributed than degrees are in the economy. And this is not just a model that you need a staffing business to execute on. We see opportunities across the range of business services companies via what we call outsourced apprenticeship programs. This is a company, Tectonic, that we backed last year. It was a software development shop. And then about 2 years ago, they were approved as the first registered apprenticeship for software development. So from that time, they were able to go out to clients with a very novel value proposition, which is not only will we develop your mobile app for you, but we'll solve your talent pipeline need, because once our apprentices have built 1,000 hours to your projects, you can, and we hope that you'll hire them. So that's really interesting to lots of big companies out there, to kill two birds with one stone. And we think that this model of the outsourced apprenticeship, where the locus of the apprenticeship is in the business service provider, in the intermediary, rather than in the end employer, saving employers from starting apprenticeship programs they really don't want to deal with, and allowing intermediaries with a commercial incentive to scale talent provision as a core component of their value proposition. This is how we're going to solve this problem. So the combination of outsourced apprenticeship models at business services companies and adding last mile training to staffing businesses, it really helped us conceptualize the fact that really everything we've talked about in education and trying to close the skills gap has been an education up approach, meaning we try and sit around the table and figure out what skills are missing. We develop the curriculum, we recruit the students, we deliver the curriculum, we graduate the students, we kind of hope and pray they find jobs. And that's everything we've done until now. An employer down model starts with intermediaries like staffing and business services companies that already have relationships with dozens or hundreds of employers. They've done the hard work. They have the ear of these large employers. Not only that, they have the ear of the actual managers and executives at the employer who are responsible for work and talent, not just HR, which increasingly is a regulatory and compliance function within the enterprise, but the actual managers who can make decisions around staffing contracts and services contracts, consult with the employer on needed skills, build last mile training into their model, and provide talent, proven talent, purpose-trained talent up to employers on a try before you buy basis, eliminating hiring friction for the employer and eliminating education friction for the candidate. So we're super excited about all these models. It actually represents sort of our main focus now as investors. And one thing that all these last mile training models have in common, of course, is that they don't rely on traditional accredited colleges or classrooms, for example. So I'm reminded of the book that came out in 2017, Janesville, which talks about the closing of the GM plant in Janesville, Wisconsin, where the 3,000 displaced auto workers were all shuttled over to the local community college and told that their only pathway to now a new career lay through this college classroom, whether it be a certificate program or two-year program, but they had to enroll in the college. You won't be surprised to learn that 2/3 of them didn't complete, right? This is a population that probably wasn't too successful in a traditional academic environment, 10, 20, 30 years ago, and they weren't. We are very excited about these last mile training models because they don't look like classrooms, right? They look like they're workplaces, actually. And in the models, the employer pay models, the employer down models that we're most excited about, you're actually hired. You're not paying tuition, you're hired as an employee from day one, and you're being paid. Another point I want to make is that these pathways, these new last mile training pathways, should foster greater geographic mobility, right? We're very concerned about the fact that Americans are less mobile than ever. They're moving less than ever, particularly millennials as well. They're not moving to the most dynamic regions where there are the greatest opportunities. Well, one way to help improve mobility is to guarantee employment, right? I mean, the Reviture model is you'll have your training. Reviture is now working with West Virginia University, for example. You do your training at West Virginia University, but you're guaranteed a job. The Reviture's hiring you, but the deal is that you're going to go, Reviture may staff you out to Bank of America in Charlotte, and you'll relocate to Charlotte, but you have that guaranteed employment, and so that's going to help facilitate that mobility as well, in a way that simply asking someone in West Virginia to move to Charlotte wouldn't. In the book, there's a directory of about 250 programs in the book. And most of them are tuition pay boot camps, but an increasing percentage are apprenticeships and staffing plus last mile training models, as I've talked about. One thing I want to mention is that we intentionally excluded in the book pathways that lead to traditional building and industrial trade jobs, not because we don't think they're good jobs, we do, not because you can't make six figures doing those jobs, you can. The problem is that alternative to college is identified in the minds of most American families as equivalent to these jobs. And most American families would say, that's a great job, but not for my child. They say, for someone else's child, but not for my child. My child's going to go to college. And we want to disprove that and demonstrate that, in fact, these pathways, these emerging last mile training pathways, are really leading to the jobs in technology, fintech, and so forth, the very jobs that college graduates are having a hard time getting. So that's the focus. These pathways will remain and should be valued. So I just have, I think, a minute to wrap up. Pardon? No, oh, no, 10. Okay. I've just been told I have time. Okay, and questions. Okay, 5. So if you can envision a world where there are thousands of these new pathways that sort of sit outside of the traditional accredited college and university model in 5 years' time, what does that mean for the college choice, right? Today when we think about the college choice, it's more of a where do you go to college as opposed to whether you go to college. But in my world, I believe we'll have a more fundamental decision to make, which is whether to go. And whether to go I believe, depends on, well, what are your college options, right? If you get into a selective college and it's affordable, and I'll give you that definition in a moment, no one will be a bit bigger cheerleader than me. You should go. That is absolutely the right decision to make. Conversely, if it's a non-selective school and it's unaffordable, per your definition, you should see a big red light, right? Why do that when there are alternative pathways that can lead you in a financially risk-free way to a good first job? Now, it may not be the good first job that you wanted if you had made the investment of $40,000 of student loan debt into that degree, but it is probably a better decision for most people than taking the risk that millennials have been asked to take over the last 20 years or so. What is affordable? Well, here's what Lumina Foundation says we should use. This is the rule of 10 that came out a couple years ago, and it says that students should pay no more for college than what families were able to save with 10% of discretionary income for the past 10 years, plus what they can earn working 10 hours a week at school. So if your family makes $100,000 a year, your total contribution for 4 years of college, everything all in, student debt out of pocket, should be less than $65,000, right? If your family makes $50,000 a year, your total contribution for 4 years should be less than $16,000. So not a lot of schools in the country where you could say that's true. There are some work colleges, there are a couple of public 4 years where you might get close to that. But virtually all privates, with the exception of the most elite, which are need-based and replace loans with grants, are out of the question at that point. So that's the challenge. So if you were to go back to this matrix, what you see is a small dot of green and a big sea of red on this thing. So that's the concern. That's the concern. Particularly relevant, I think, in a world where employers are already demonstrating open-mindedness around whether or not they want degrees, right? There are companies like Ernst & Young in the UK which have said, not only do we not require degrees for entry-level jobs, but we're going to actually hide from hiring managers whether candidates have degrees, because we think it's a misleading indicator of whether a candidate is actually ready or a good candidate for this job. And I'll end on this note. The fact that young people were encouraged to load up on debt just as they were starting their careers will seem bizarre and anachronistic a decade from now, a practice that benefited colleges and universities much more than the students they aim to serve. And in hindsight, given all the uncertainty around technological change in the future of work, it will seem incredible that we asked millennials to risk taking on all this debt at one time at such a young age. And I'll leave it with that and see if we have any questions. Thank you. Sure. Yeah. Just if anyone has questions, just there's a mic right here.
So come.
Sorry, we'll need you to.
So come to the middle and hand the microphone.
First, I want to thank you for that talk. This was really interesting. I work in higher education, and one thing I wondered throughout your talk was, what place do you think higher education does have in this new world?
That was a slide I was going to get to. So I think that I'm not arguing for I don't have that slide. I'm not arguing for a reduction in the aggregate or per capita level of post-secondary education. In this global economy, that would be economic suicide. What I am suggesting is that we think about restaging how we consume higher education, where we shouldn't be forcing young people to sort of do an all-you-can-eat in one sitting before the age of 25. You should be able to, and it should be socially acceptable and arguably higher status to do a faster and cheaper pathway to a good first job. Get your foot on the first rung of a career ladder with no debt, work for a couple of years, and then look around and ascertain what secondary or tertiary pathway will allow you to achieve the cognitive skills, executive function skills you'll need to move on, move up, become a manager, and so forth. So really what I'm suggesting is, for decades we've asked the question, everyone has sort of said lifelong learning is the way to go. How do we affect lifelong learning? What I'm suggesting is the way lifelong learning comes to fruition is over the next 10 years, as hundreds of thousands and then millions of young people opt for a faster and cheaper pathway to a good first job instead of a 4-year degree program, because those young people will then need secondary, tertiary pathways. And so what can colleges and universities do faced with this? Well, one, they can do a better job of helping their students get jobs, good first jobs. But also, they should be thinking about what those secondary and tertiary pathways are to help young workers develop those cognitive skills that four-year degrees are ostensibly supposed to help develop. And I view that as sort of an unbundled master's program that are, it's not 2 years, but it's job function specific, industry specific, but really helping to build those cognitive skills. So if I were to, I'm somewhat bearish on undergraduate education. I'm bullish on graduate education. I think that's where we're going to see the innovation. Thanks.
Thank you for a great presentation. I wonder if you could comment on what might be another species here that is a blend of learning up and employer down. And I'm thinking of models like College for America, which are subscription-based and B2B, since it's really mostly employers in their model that are bearing the cost.
Yeah, no, look, we're fans of competency-based education. We think that employers, Guild is a good example of trying to help have employers use a college education as a benefit. I think that's terrific. But that's not solving necessarily the sort of the problem of how do you make the connection between young people and a good first job, or older workers who require upskilling and retraining and a good first job in a growing sector of the economy. Most of those employees are already have their foot on the first rung of that ladder. So they're helping to upskill. I do believe that is, you didn't hear me say much about sort of online education in this presentation. That is where online education is already dominating and will increasingly dominate. The point from good first job to successful career, all of that human capital development will be done online. No question about it. I question whether online education has an important role to play between high school and good first job, because it's a combination of technical skills and soft skills that I haven't seen online do in a effective way yet. Thanks.
Hi, I'm Helen Wang. I'm the CEO of Six Crickets. I really appreciate your visionary talk. So you worked backwards from the job employment to the university and how we need to look at it fundamentally differently. I'd like to ask you for your input on how we can move it even backwards about the K-12 education. If university is 5-10 years out of date, for K-12 educations, are we also 5-10 years out of date or even more? And how do we bridge the gap in the K-12 education and to encourage innovation, new way of teaching and so on, and to also bridge the gap to college level learning or last mile education?
Yeah, it's a great question. We have lots of foundations we're working with who are very focused on that question of what happens in a faster and cheaper world, and how do you create pathways right out of high school to these programs. One way is there obviously needs to be more career discovery in high school. If you're going to opt for a faster and cheaper pathway to a good first job, you have to understand what these jobs are and what these skills are. So that's certainly one. But a lot of it is the fact that colleges, K-12 systems have evaluated themselves, and even the Ed Reform and the charter school organizations have measured themselves on the sort of college readiness and college acceptance metric. And what we've seen is that that's not sort of a great metric for long-term success, because many of these districts and charter school systems have very poor college completion rates. And so our question is, well, what happens in Denver, say, when there are 10 different pathways, each hiring thousands of students, or with the opportunity to hire thousands of young people, potentially right out of high school, into good entry-level jobs in business intelligence and cybersecurity and lab tech and so forth. And what do those opportunities do to Denver public schools in terms of thinking about high school curriculum, right? Should we note stats becomes more important than calculus, clearly at that point. That debate then is over. because calculus is valued by college as sort of a weed out course for STEM majors, but that's not as relevant when you're talking about workforce and entry-level jobs.
Thank you.
Thank you. One last question. Sorry. Thanks.
Thanks. And my question was actually very similar to hers. I work in marketing and CTE, career and technical education, high schools. And so I was just wondering, along those same lines, do you see career exploration becoming a much larger focus in high school and even elementary school? And maybe how can ed tech companies like us really work towards giving students a better career exploration experience?
Yeah. I hope so, but with one big caveat, which is that what we don't want to see is what happens in Germany, right? Everyone sort of looks at Germany, but where students are tracked from as early as middle school. We do not want that. So I think what we want to do is we want to provide options. I think we want to provide career discovery education in high school, but make sure that every high school graduate has a certain level of cognitive skills, soft skills, and digital skills as well, so they can then choose a pathway and be informed about it. Thanks. Thank you so much. An honor. Thank you.